Over the last few weeks, Rob and I have been talking about how property investors should be acting right now. But we don't know. We speak to a few people, we get emails, but we haven't interviewed investors. But luckily, Chantelle, our magazine editor, has. In this week's episode, we're going to find out what is actually happening with property investors.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property investors come to be informed and inspired. It's going to be great to talk to Chantelle in this episode. Really looking forward to the conversation because we know what we're doing in these unprecedented times. You know what you're doing, but is it normal? What should we be doing? What's everyone else up to? Well, we're going to find out in today's episode.
So, Rob, this week we've been reading a rental report on what's going on in the market right now, and it's pretty comprehensive. And you said before we started recording today that there's been loads of focus on property prices, but not many people are talking about the rental market. And that's true. So it's great to see a report like this come out to help us understand what's actually happening out there.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at what has happened over the last month, 6 weeks or so. And also interesting to speculate about what might happen next when we finally get to the point that lockdown restrictions are eased. If you go and look at this data that's been put together by Zoopla, it shows that from March the 7th, which is when things really started to get serious, up to the end of March, rental demand fell by 57%, which obviously is massive and is understandable. Didn't fall by as much as sales demand, which again is understandable because selling it and buying is a far bigger commitment. Since then, in the first 2 weeks of April, which is the period that they had the data for here, demand rose by 30%. So it rose by 30% from its fall. So it's still down on where it was, but it had picked up. And that tallies with what we've seen at Property Hub Lets. Last week was by far our busiest week in terms of lettings since this all started. And it does seem like people are doing their best to get on with their lives. The report also notes that there hasn't actually been a fall in the amount of rental property on the market. So it's not like landlords pulled all their listings down when this started. Understandably, they've left their listings up and either hoped to get lucky or reduced their rents to try a bit harder to try to get someone in. And actually, there's been an increase in supply because there's been lots of people who previously were renting out properties short term. That market obviously has completely gone away temporarily. So those have been listed for long-term let either instead or as well. So I think that's all really interesting, but more interesting, Rob, is to speculate a little bit about what might happen next in terms of rental demand and rent prices, which obviously are both intertwined, because there are lots of different factors in play that you could look at to say that rents are going to fall or indeed that rents are going to rise.
Indeed. We've talked about on the podcast before that we wouldn't be surprised when we come through this that there's a rental boom, a mini boom at least anyway, and that can just be caused by the pent-up demand that people who haven't been moving, because although the trend is up at the moment, it's still below normal levels, that they go, right, now it's time to move. So those people who would have normally moved during this time will move then, and that will cause a mini boom. But there are other factors that could contribute to that. So, for example, there's a lot of people in the world right now reassessing their lives and going, how do I want to live at that point? Where do I want to live at that point? There's so many decisions can be made. Sometimes it may be through choice, and sometimes it may be because it's forced upon them. That life has changed for them. Maybe their income levels are down and they're having to move. Maybe people have fallen out and they are going their separate ways. Maybe there's a trend to people moving out of cities and into areas that they have a bit more green space because they've really missed that during this lockdown. So areas outside cities do really well. Again, these are just theories, but they all, on a surface level, make a lot of sense. But a lot of these things point to a bit of a rental boom. There are a few factors that could play out as well, though, that could go against that rental boom happening.
Yeah, the obvious one, of course, is unemployment. So if you end up with lots of people unemployed, or you have self-employed people whose income has fallen, that reduces the rents that people can afford to pay. So the report also says that at the moment, the average single earner is spending 31.6% of their earnings on rent. And that figure of around a third is pretty consistent over time. So if wages fall on average, then you'd expect rents to fall as well. You've also got individual mini markets that are going to be affected in different ways. And the student market is an obvious example. it's possible that there'll be a decrease in foreign students in particular registering for the next academic year. That means, of course, specialist student accommodation will be affected. And more broadly, university cities where international students make up a decent chunk of the overall demand will see a reduction in demand as well. So I think when you look back at the data in, say, a year's time, you'll probably see a fall in rents for this period that we're living through right now, because not many people are moving and landlords are rightly cutting rents to try to make their property the one that does get let. Then I'd say that immediately afterwards, it's likely that we will see a little mini boom because of that pent-up demand that we've talked about. But then what about 3 months, 6 months after that? Where do things settle down? That's more difficult to call, and it's going to be a really interesting one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I completely agree, Rob. And if I was pushed further to make a prediction, and no one's pushing me, but I'll do it anyway, I think by the end of the year, the data will show that rents actually went up over the 12-month period. So whatever's lost will be regained and will end in positive territory.
So the latest issue of the Property Hub magazine has just been published, and it'll be hitting your doormat any time now if you are a subscriber. If you're not a subscriber, then you're too late. You should have acted earlier, but it's okay. You can still subscribe now and get future editions, and you'll get instant access to all our back issues online. So if you've got a bit of time on your hands at the moment, you can go back through and read years worth of magazines as soon as you subscribe. That will include this latest episode where our cover story is, unsurprisingly, about the coronavirus and all the fallout from that, in particular how investors are adapting to this new normal that we find ourselves in. In the feature, Chantelle, our editor, goes out and talks to lots of investors to find out all the different things they're doing, and a lot of it's really, really interesting. We thought it'd be great to share some extra information from what Chantelle found with her conversations from investors all over the country and invite her onto the podcast for a chat with me and Rob.
So, Chantelle, all around the world, we're seeing acts of kindness, people helping out their fellow human, which is lovely to see. But landlords don't have the best of reputations when it comes to humanity at all. In fact, they've got quite a bad reputation, and possibly unfairly so. But what are you seeing? What kind of response are landlords having to the coronavirus and with their tenants?
So there's been some really great examples of kindness and compassion from landlords, whether it's from the small gestures like reaching out to tenants and just checking they're okay, to offering, we've seen a lot of landlords offering vacant properties, whether it's free or charge or for a small rent to NHS and frontline workers. It seems really that the us versus them mentality has faded into the background, and now it's much more about how do we find a solution to get through this together.
Really nice to hear. From what you're seeing, is it the tenants asking for help, or is it landlords making themselves approachable if the tenants do request something?
Yeah, well, communication, I think, between landlords and tenants has been really, really important over the past few weeks. From the landlords that I've spoken to, they've been the ones making the first move. So they've been contacting tenants rather than waiting for them to get in touch. This has just helped avoid any problems that tenants might have escalating into bigger issues by putting the plans in place right from the start.
And what kind of assistance are landlords offering? Is there a typical type of relief that you're seeing?
For those tenants that need them, landlords have been setting up payment plans. So that seems to be the typical type of relief. Some cases I've seen landlords offering rent-free periods until the tenants receive the support from the government. But I've also heard of landlords going the extra mile by assisting with applications for universal credit and providing translation support for those tenants that need it on the phone.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And like we heard from Mark Morris on the podcast last week when we were talking about universal credit, it is difficult, that application process, and it is really important. He was emphasising that landlords do get involved in that process and make sure it goes smoothly. So it's good to hear landlords are doing that, and it's something that perhaps more should be as well. So it's really nice to hear that traditional friction, I suppose, between landlords and tenants has broken down and they're finding ways to work together. Investors as well are going to need help, though, because the emphasis is rightly on tenants' needs, but there are investors out there who are struggling as well and not knowing what they should do in the light of everything that's going on. Are you seeing any instances of investors helping each other out and helping them to decide how they should adapt their strategy, things like that?
Yes, well, you only have to look at our forum to see how investors are helping each other out by sharing information and knowledge and advice. There's so much going on there. And in the feature, obviously, I spoke to landlords about how they were helping each other out. They all said that they are pulling together. And not only that, there's been some cross-sector sharing going on too. Specifically in the feature, one landlord explains how he's getting passed on business from hotels that he'd usually be competing against. So it's not just exclusively landlords helping landlords out or investors. So it seems to be people are coming together and helping each other out. And it's not just exclusively investors helping investors, as the feature illustrates.
And what about investors? Are they just sitting around watching Netflix? I mean, Tiger King is compulsive viewing. Or are they doing stuff behind the scenes? Are they getting ready to take action?
Yeah, far from it. I don't think there's many investors just sitting around watching Tiger King, although there might be spaces in their schedule for that. But aside from dealing with the challenges that a lot of landlords and investors are facing, a lot of the ones that I spoke to for the feature were using the extra time to get themselves in the best possible shape for when normality is restored. So it's not just about preparing for when restrictions are lifted, though. For those that are able to, they're putting themselves in a position now to snap up good deals as and when they come up, not just waiting for when restrictions are lifted.
That's really interesting. So in what ways are they doing that?
The feature highlights some really smart thinking from investors. One made it their mission to view as many properties as possible before lockdown and picked up a few deals as a result. And another told us how he's been busy making sure he's on the radar of all his local agents. So he's the one that's first in line for any good deals that cross their desks.
Now, in this environment, Chantelle, investors are having to adapt. What are you seeing happen out there?
Well, it's not just investors that are having to adapt. Like all other businesses, lenders and agents are adapting as well. And they're coming up with new systems to navigate our current situation. So some of the investors that I spoke to told me how they're kind of getting deals through by drive-by valuations or desktop valuations. And also a lot of letting agents are offering virtual viewings as well.
So it sounds like while the common wisdom is that the market has stopped, and obviously in some very visible places it has, investors are still busy, and get the impression that when people can get out and about again, there'll be some well-researched investors out there ready to strike some deals.
Yes, absolutely. Those who've used their time wisely and done the preparation will be in a much stronger position when the restrictions are lifted.
Not everyone right now is in a position to buy. So what are you finding those people are doing in this current climate?
Well, the feeling amongst those landlords that I've spoken to is, as tough as these times are, it isn't just about survival. It's about taking advantage of the opportunities that it's presenting. So, yeah, they might not be able to invest at the moment. So there's the opportunity to do that location research that you've been meaning to do, to set out your goals, to boost your knowledge or seek professional advice so that when the time's right, you're ready to take action.
So what we've heard there from Chantelle, Rob, is really interesting. And what you'd want to hear as well, like you hope these things are happening and going on, and investors are reacting this way, and landlords are being kind and generous. But when you actually hear that it actually is happening, then it's great.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cliche, isn't it, about a crisis bringing people together? But we've seen it with politicians who are working together more constructively, and landlords and tenants are putting their differences aside and finding ways of working as well. It kind of makes you think, why can't we do this all the time? This is way better.
Yeah, I really hope that this is something that is a lasting legacy, that landlords generally maybe perceive a little more warmer and kinder than, and that we, because we are, that's the thing. The majority of landlords are lovely, normal people who do care about other humans and not evil. Of course, there are some evil landlords. We talked about this in last Friday's market update about, the majority of society are great people, but there's going to be a small section who get the headlines. And unfortunately, in the past, it's that small section of landlords who aren't very nice who get all the headlines, while the majority of us are actually normal, decent humans.
I thought it was interesting as well to hear about all the activity that is going on, because all the headlines you see are about everything that's not happening, like the massive percentage drops in activity levels in just about everything you can imagine. But when you do dig a bit deeper, of course, there are lots of things that aren't happening, but it's certainly not the case that everyone's just putting their feet up for a few weeks. There seems to be loads going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Investors, landlords, they're not falling asleep. They are taking action or are preparing to take action. And it would be such a waste of an opportunity if they didn't. You know, people are forced into their homes right now and probably do have more time free than they've had before. So using that time wisely to come out of this stronger is brilliant. You know, it's something that we've been advocating on the podcast for the last few weeks now, but it's great to see that playing out.
And it is ramping up as well, I think, as we come to what we hope is getting towards the end of this, because it was definitely the case to start with. The talk of coronavirus was just consuming everything. No one was talking about anything else or thinking about anything else. And just looking at measures like we've got access to lots of data points from like traffic to the website, posts on the forum, all the way down to things which are really subjective, but still tell a bit of a story, which is like the number of emails that I get from people who've read the books and things like that and asking questions. That absolutely dropped off a cliff for a couple of weeks, but it's come back really strongly. And the last couple of weeks, things have been as busy as ever, if not more so in places. So it definitely seems to be the case that having got over the shock, people are now really thinking, okay, how can I make the most of it? And they realise that the world's not ending.
You know what, though? You will feel like your world is ending if you miss this magazine. It's coming out at the beginning of May. Now, if you haven't subscribed already, you can do. You'll get the digital copy, and you can access all the back copies if you subscribe now. If you've already subscribed, don't worry. We've not changed process. You're going to get that print version. But make sure you do subscribe so you get all the other future print versions that we have. They're every 2 months. And Chantelle, our editor, as you've heard, does an amazing job, brings in amazing guests, really digs deep in so many subjects, so much more than we can do on a podcast. So if you enjoy the podcast, you're going to love the magazine. So that is our Hub Extra this week. We don't often say, take advantage of something that we have, but the magazine is a very worthy Hub Extra. And during the lockdown, you can go through all those back issues digitally, learn more, absorb more, put yourself in a stronger position. And that's what this is all about.
Not bad for a fiver. And hopefully you'll agree this podcast hasn't been too bad for free. That's us done for today, but we'll be back tomorrow with our regular Friday market update. And then we'll be doing it all again next week, of course. 3 more podcasts coming your way. In the meantime, let us know what you think about everything we're doing. Let us know what you're up to. We are on all the socials at Property Hub UK. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.